By the time Yu Yin walked through the gates of Chunhan High School, he had spent the last 10 years of his life learning how to kill people. He looked like a transfer student, quiet, slightly stiff through the shoulders, with eyes that didn't settle on anything for long. His school bag was second-hand, and his shoes were a little too new, the way shoes look when someone had to buy them specifically for this because they hadn't owned school shoes in a very long time. Nobody paid much attention. Students at Chunhan rarely bothered with midterm arrivals who came without visible social history. The boys currently making his little sister's life miserable had no idea who had just walked through those gates. Before any of that, before the things that would ripple through the neighborhood in whispered, confused versions that still didn't capture how fast it had actually happened, there was a plane. Yu Yin was 9 years old when it fell out of the sky. He had been traveling with his parents. The crash took both of them, and, along with them, most of his memory. What survived was fragmentary, a jacket that smelled a certain way, a hand folding a seatbelt with particular care before clicking it, the blue of a sleeve. Nothing that could reconstruct a life, just evidence that one had existed. He survived the crash with no serious physical injury, which was something like a miracle. What followed was not. He was found by people moving through that part of the world who looked at an uninjured, clearly resilient boy in a conflict zone and recognized him as useful. They brought him to a camp in a jungle region that had no clean local name. The people who passed through it on the other side, not many did, called it the forest. The forest did not consider itself a school, but it taught. It organized its trainees by number, assigned in order of combat performance. Numbers went down as you proved yourself. The lower the number, the fewer people stood above you. Number 001 was the top of the pyramid. The camp expected every trainee to justify their rank daily, through demonstration, not sentiment. Yin arrived young. He was among the smallest in the camp, and the instructors made sure he understood this. Harder training, shorter rest, the kind of attention that doubles as pressure. The older trainees looked at him with the flat assessment of people who expected the problem to resolve itself. It did not resolve. Not the way they expected. He trained. Boys older and heavier than him washed out of the program in ways the camp declined to explain to whoever was left. He memorized his instructor's breathing patterns during demonstrations, because a change in breath preceded a strike by half a second, and half a second was worth knowing. At night, he slept on his side to keep fresh bruises off the floor. Food was whatever they served, and he stopped noting when it ran out before he was full. He got better, first slowly, then in a way that stopped being gradual, like heat that builds unnoticed until the surface breaks. What he had was nothing the camp had trained into him, a complete refusal to stop. Not aggression, not pride, something quieter and more durable than either, the kind that doesn't announce itself until the conditions require it. By the time he was 16, he held number 001. That number meant he was the best in the organization. He led other numbered operatives in the field. He completed missions other numbers could not. The people who ran the camp regarded him with something that, in a different institution, might have been called pride. From Yin's perspective, it meant he had survived something most people didn't. It did not mean he belonged there. Memory had been returning, not cleanly, not in ways that made the past feel whole again, but in fragments that accumulated. An old man with careful hands, a small apartment somewhere, a little girl with his own eyes, too young at the time of the crash to have been more than a toddler. A name he kept turning over quietly to himself in the dark. John. He had a family. They believed he was dead. The longer he stayed in the forest, doing the work it required, the more the space between him and that family felt like weight he had been carrying without naming. He made his decision. He left. The organization did not recognize the concept of an asset walking away. They called it betrayal and had a clear policy on it. Yin had weighed the consequences with the same measured attention he gave to everything. The coming pursuit, the risks, the cost. And had reached the same conclusion each time. His family mattered more than his safety. This was not a heroic calculation. It was simply the only one he could live with. He came back to Korea with one bag and no announcement. He moved through the arrivals hall watching exits out of old habit, looking like any young man returning somewhere he had not been in a very long time. His grandfather was waiting at the gate with a handwritten sign. Kongshu was smaller than Yin expected, or smaller than whatever internal image a decade of distance had built. He had the careful posture of someone whose joints had started offering opinions, and he held the sign with both hands, Yin's name written in large, slightly uneven characters that looked practiced. The handwriting of someone who had rehearsed this specific set of strokes many times in preparation for today. He had come to the airport in a pressed jacket and polished shoes, dressed for something important, because for him it was. He had not yet spotted Yin in the crowd. Yin crossed the hall. His grandfather looked up. Neither of them said anything right away. Hangshu reached up and put both hands on Yin's face. The way you touch something you have spent years unsure was real. His eyes went very bright. Yin stood still and let him. They did not talk much on the way home. Kong Shu kept his hand on Yin's arm for most of the drive, and neither of them needed to fill the silence. The apartment was small and warm. It smelled like food that had been cooking since early morning. The pots still held heat, and on the kitchen counter, a handwritten shopping list had every ingredient crossed off one by one, in order. John came home 20 minutes later. She came through the door with her school bag strap looped and twisted around one hand, a habit people develop when they need something to grip. She had their mother's eyes. She stopped when she saw Yin standing in the hallway. For a long moment, she did not move. Then she crossed the room and pressed her face against his shoulder, and he put his arms around her and kept quiet. She had grown. He could tell within seconds that she was carrying something she had not shared with their grandfather. The bruise on her left arm had faded to yellow, old enough not to be fresh, recent enough not to be forgotten. She held herself with a practiced stillness that was not shyness, the posture of someone who had learned not to invite attention, because attention had consequences. Yin filed it. He said nothing. Dinner that night was the three of them at a table built for two. Kongshu was genuinely happy, visibly so, in the unguarded way of someone whose long waiting was finally over. He talked. He served food twice. He mentioned, in passing, that he had put a small lamp in Yin's room and would leave a glass of water on the bedside table every night. Partway through the meal, he let slip a worried tangent about John's school, caught himself, and redirected. John went still across the table. The subject was changed. The door was open now, regardless. Yin asked John afterward, while their grandfather washed dishes. Quietly, without urgency in his voice. He simply waited. She had perhaps needed someone to ask her in exactly that way, without the adult panic that makes everything heavier, because she told him everything. A girl at school, named Kim Heejin, months of it. The kind of cruelty that escalates each time it goes unchallenged, that borrows other people's weight to press down harder. Heejin's older brother Kim Kisu controlled a network that operated outside school grounds, which meant John had no safe hours and no safe route home. She had been isolated, frightened, and working hard to hide the scale of it from their grandfather because she knew it would hurt him. Yin thanked her. He went to bed. He lay on his back staring at the ceiling. His grandfather had left the small lamp on and a glass of water on the bedside table, exactly as promised. He looked at both things for a moment before returning to the problem. A direct approach to Kisu would only signal that the previous approach had failed and encourage him to find a different one. What Yin needed was to make the cost of continuing so clear that the calculation resolved itself. He needed information first. He would start there. Chunhan High School received its newest transfer student with the indifferent school's reserve for midterm arrivals with no visible social backing. Yin sat through his first day and noted positions, which doors teachers used, where the hall sightlines ran, who moved with what kind of authority. Kim Heejin was not difficult to identify. She moved through the school with the confidence of someone who had never needed to revise her position within these walls. Surrounded always by the same cluster of girls, her brother's reputation extended into the building even in his absence. The threat of him was a presence of its own, doing most of the work. John sat 3 rows from Heejin in a shared class. Yin watched how John tracked her, small, involuntary glances, monitoring that had become habit. He watched Heejin lean in during a class transition and say something low into John's ear that drained the color from John's face in under 2 seconds. At the end of the day, Heejin dispatched a boy with nothing more than a look and a tilt of her head. He left toward the school gates with 2 companions, following John at a distance. Yin followed all of them. 2 blocks from school, in a side street beside a delivery company's parking lot, where there was no afternoon foot traffic, the 3 boys cornered John. The largest one positioned himself in front while the others flanked. John stopped walking and kept her eyes on the ground. Yin came around the corner. He walked toward them without hurrying and without slowing. The large boy turned and told him to keep moving. Yin did not. What happened next was efficient. The large boy moved with the confidence of someone whose size had always settled this kind of argument. Yin stepped to the side, took the offered arm, and used the boy's own momentum to put him on the ground. He landed on his shoulder and made a breathless sound. Not seriously hurt, but suddenly uncertain about the physics of the last 3 seconds. The second boy grabbed from behind. Yin turned, caught the grab, and pinned him against the parking lot fence with a forearm across his chest. Hard enough to be instructive. The third one stayed where he was. Yin stepped back and looked at all three. He told John, at normal conversational volume, that they could go home. She stared at him. She had the expression of someone who has been running a calculation for a long time and has just arrived at a completely different answer. They walked the rest of the way in silence. At the apartment door, she turned and asked where he had learned to fight like that. He said he had picked it up. She did not press it. But she watched him for the rest of the evening with very careful eyes. The three boys talked, the way boys who end up on the ground in under 10 seconds always do, and their account was filtered through enough embarrassment that by the time it reached Kim Ki-soo, it had acquired details that made the event more dramatic and less accurate. Ki-soo was not a patient man with inexplicable things. He sent a larger group the next afternoon. Yin had anticipated this. He positioned himself near a convenience store in the neighborhood, visible and apparently alone, and waited for the runner he had noticed during school hours to confirm his location to whoever was waiting. 6 came. A few were older than high school age, which meant Ki-soo had drawn from a broader pool. The fight lasted just over a minute. Yin moved through it without urgency. Methodical, quiet, placing each resolution where it was most needed. The first 2 were down, before the rest had finished settling into their positions. The next 2 coordinated, which bought them a few extra seconds. The 5th made the sensible choice of stepping back. The 6th followed him. Yin checked his jacket. The collar had been grabbed and twisted slightly. He went back into the store for the water he had been about to buy. The report Ki-soo received that evening was quieter than the previous one. Nobody embellished this time. Embellishment would have required explaining the part where 6 of them failed to do what they were sent for. Ki-soo escalated further. Not boys this time, men. 3 adults from the edge of his network who understood the difference between establishing presence and work that carried real risk. They waited near the entrance to the apartment building's underground parking on a Saturday morning. Yin recognized the shift before he reached them. Different posture. Different footwear. These were people who occasionally did difficult things for compensation, and they had prepared on the assumption that the target was a strong teenager who had gotten lucky twice. He closed the distance before they had finished spreading out, which was the opposite of what they expected. 2 went down quickly. The third reached inside his jacket. Yin was behind him before the hand came back out, holding the man's arm at an angle that communicated, precisely and specifically, the structural options available to the shoulder joint. The man stopped moving. His companions were kneeling. Nobody was seriously injured. Yin asked who had sent them. The man answered. He released him and stood in the parking lot after they left, thinking. He had been gathering information over the past week, listening through the neighborhood in the careful, unremarked way of someone who expects to be underestimated. He had built a picture of the Kim family's arrangements, the father's business connections, money moving through accounts the family name was officially not attached to, the specific ways the family had historically made complaints about Heejin's behavior disappear before they could take root anywhere permanent. He had enough. The patience he had set for himself was finished. Kim Ki-soo received 2 visitors at the establishment his father's name was officially disconnected from, on a Tuesday morning. Not police, not journalists. Yin walked in wearing his school jacket, the one with the slightly twisted collar, and sat across from Ki-soo, with the relaxed posture of someone who had already considered every response the other man was likely to have. 3 of Ki-soo's associates made the mistake of standing up. They were back on their level before Yin's chair had fully settled on the floor behind him. The 4th reconsidered. Ki-soo had not moved. Yin placed a phone on the table. He said he had certain information about the Kim family's private arrangements that would interest several people currently outside this room. This information was secure, and he had no desire to share it, provided 3 conditions were met. The conditions were simple. John would not be approached again. Hee-jin would redirect her attention permanently and completely. Kisu's network would withdraw from the school, the surrounding streets, and the apartment building at whatever distance made the absence felt. Kisu was a man who had always held the stronger position in rooms like this one. He looked at the phone, at the men on his floor, at the boy across from him who had not raised his voice once during any of it, and he ran the numbers. They kept coming out the same. He agreed. He spent the following weeks trying to find out exactly who Yu Yin was. The school record was real. The name was real. Everything else dissolved when looked at directly, like something only visible from the corner of your eye. He found nothing that satisfied him. This unsettled him more than the men on his floor had. John noticed the change first. Hee-jin stopped looking at her. Kisu's people were gone from the routes she walked. The pressure that had been constant for months simply lifted, the way a long-held breath finally releases. She did not ask Yin what he had done. She had tried that question once, and understood that his answers were not quite answers. Instead, she watched him, patient and very observant, trying to reconcile what she was seeing with everything she had assumed she knew about her brother. Kong Shu cooked larger meals and hummed while he did it. Yin recognized this as the behavioral signature of a man whose worry had been set down. Across the city, in an office that dealt in many things, security, intelligence, the identification of people who could handle difficult situations reliably, a brief report crossed a desk. It noted a young man with unusual capabilities and an opaque background, currently enrolled at Chunhan High School. The SW group had considerable resources and considerable need for people who could do things that ordinary people simply could not. A meeting was arranged. His name was Yu Yin. He was 17 years old and had, without apparent effort, dismantled every threat structure operating against his family in the span of a few weeks. What he could do with more room to work in was a question several people were now very interested in finding out. The SW group occupied 3 floors of a building in central Seoul that had the quiet self-assurance of organizations that have never needed to advertise their importance. The lobby had real stone floors and staff who moved with the practiced invisibility of people paid to anticipate. There was a waiting area with chairs nobody sat in for long, and an elevator bank that required a card for floors above the 5th. Yin arrived 12 minutes early and read the emergency evacuation map on the lobby wall while he waited. Old habit. He noted 2 stairwells, the service entrance behind reception, the camera positions. He did this the way other people check their phone, without thinking about it, because the habit was older than the awareness of it. The man who came to collect him was a security team captain named Sang Jin-soo, who looked at Yin with the particular professional neutrality reserved for young men who arrive at serious organizations in school uniforms and have somehow been told they belong there. Jin-soo was polite. He was also performing a constant low-level assessment that Yin recognized, the way someone in the security field sizes a new variable in the room. They rode up in the elevator. Jin-soo confirmed the time for the evaluation session and mentioned, in a tone designed to be offhand, that the team's current top scorer had broken the company assessment record 3 months prior. He was watching Yin's face when he said it. Yin thanked him for the information. The evaluation area was a converted space on the 7th floor, padded flooring, equipment along the walls, space enough for group exercises and individual demonstrations. 9 other applicants were already present. Most were older, several were significantly larger, and all of them had the bearing of people who had done formal training somewhere with a name. One wore a military posture so embedded it read in how he stood at rest. 2 others had the slightly thickened hands of dedicated combat sports practitioners. They looked at Yin the way people look at something that doesn't fit the context they were prepared for. The first portion of the evaluation was practical. Strength benchmarks, reaction tests, the kind of structured physical assessment that produces comparable data. Yin moved through it without outperforming in ways that made noise. Just steady, clean scores that landed at the high end without spectacle. He was watching the room the same way it was watching him. The second portion was a controlled sparring rotation. Each applicant cycled through matches against the existing team, assessment rather than competition. The team's fighters were competent, genuinely so, not in the performance sense. They had trained with purpose and worked together long enough to develop the automatic adjustments of people who know how their partners move. Yin was matched with a team member named Park, who fought with the economical efficiency of a man who had stopped enjoying displays about a decade ago. Park came in with a tight, experienced approach. Yin responded with something a few degrees simpler than his full range, enough to suggest the real distance between them, not enough to make the room stop and stare. Park noticed. He adjusted, found the same wall at a different angle, and pulled back to reassess. The match ended and Park looked at Yin with an expression that had moved past the professional neutrality he had started with. He said nothing out loud. He went to speak quietly to Jin-Soo instead. Jin-Soo came to stand near Yin during the break. He stood close enough to be a conversation, but far enough to be deniable if Yin didn't want one. He said the company had been looking for an additional trainee placement and that the structure would involve rotating assignments under senior team leads while completing the formal certification track. He said the pay was modest at the trainee level. He said that someone who decided to take it seriously could move through the track faster than the standard schedule allowed. He seemed slightly uncomfortable with what he was offering, the way men are when they have been told to extend something to someone who is making their professional context feel inadequate. Yin said he was interested. Shin-jae's first impression of Yu Yin was that he didn't fill the room the way people with his reported capabilities usually do. She had reviewed what Jin-Soo's team had assembled before the evaluation, which was brief because the background was thin in the specific way that suggests someone has taken careful steps, not that nothing is there, and had formed an expectation of someone performing competence. A teenager playing an adult. He sat across from her in the glass-walled room on the 8th floor and answered her questions with the directness of someone who had no performance prepared. Not arrogance, something slower and more settled than that. Jay ran operational oversight for the security division and carried the additional weight of an executive position within the family structure of the group's leadership. She was deliberate, sharp, and had been doing this work long enough to recognize when someone was hiding information versus when someone simply declined to volunteer it. Yin did the latter. She found this somewhat easier to work with. She asked him directly about his background, framing it as the kind of question that expected an incomplete answer and was simply testing how he gave it. He said he had spent a significant period abroad, that he had relevant training, and that the details were not something he could fully explain in a room like this one. She held his eyes for a moment, then she moved on. She told him the position would involve close protection work for group personnel in situations the company's primary team wasn't configured for. She told him discretion was not optional. She said the group had resources that would sometimes be available to him and that using them was at her discretion, not his, unless circumstances changed the equation. He said that sounded like a reasonable structure. She asked, near the end of the meeting, why he had enrolled in a normal high school if he had the capabilities Jin-Soo's report suggested. He said his family had never seen him finish school. She looked at him for another moment, the kind that doesn't require a response. She made a note and closed the folder. His first real assignment came 2 weeks later. A client named Kim Yukyong, a director within a subsidiary company, connected loosely to the group, had begun behaving strangely in meetings. Missing appointments he had never missed before, signing documents without reading them, arriving to calls sounding hollowed out in a way his colleagues had described, in the careful corporate language of people who prefer not to name things directly, as not himself. Yin was tasked as part of a small protection detail running a quiet observation period. His role was background, visible enough to be a deterrent, invisible enough not to escalate whatever was happening. What was happening became clear within the first several days. Yukyong's private security, his existing two-man detail, were not watching him. They were watching the doors to make sure nobody came in who wasn't supposed to. There was a difference, and it was significant. A substance was being introduced into his food. The method was simple, domestic, and had been working for several months. Someone with access to his household's daily routine was using it, and the bodyguard's position near the perimeter meant they never saw the actual moment of administration. Yin moved his observation position inside the daily pattern without flagging it to the existing detail. On the third day, he identified the mechanism. He brought it to Jay. She was quiet for a moment after he finished. She said she would need the method documented in a way that the legal team could use. He had already prepared that. The existing detail were removed. The people behind the scheme, a parallel move driven by a man named Zach Shu, connected to Yukyong through a family arrangement that had never been as friendly as its official description, found that their plan had stopped producing results without their being notified of why, which was the intended effect. When the documented evidence surfaced through the group's legal architecture, Zhak Shu's ability to operate within any connected company ceased almost immediately. Yukiong recovered. He came in person to the group offices one morning to express his thanks, and seemed unsure exactly which person in the building deserved it most. He said it felt like someone had rescued him from inside a locked room without ever opening the door. Word moved through the security team in the careful lateral way that information travels in close-knit professional environments. Not loudly, people just began to adjust their assumptions about the new trainee. Park, during a rotation session, 3 weeks after the evaluation, came at Yin with his full range. The session ran considerably longer than their first one. Afterward, Park sat on the equipment room floor with his water bottle and said, with the directness of someone who had already processed his ego about it, he would like to know where, specifically, the elbow redirect had come from, because he had never seen that entry before. Yin demonstrated it twice slowly. Park nodded. He said he would buy Yin lunch. This was Park becoming an ally, in the direct and uncomplicated way that serious professionals sometimes do, through a shared assessment of competence, skipping the social preliminaries entirely. His life had acquired a shape he had not known how to imagine during the years away. School in the morning, training in the afternoon, dinner with his grandfather and sister, evenings that sometimes contained nothing required of him, which he still found faintly unfamiliar. Kong Shu had started leaving the television on at low volume after dinner, and the sound traveled through the walls, and some part of Yin settled into it the way you settle into a room that's been waiting with the heat on. John healed slowly, visibly, in the way of a plant moved from a poor environment into a better one. She joined a study group she had been avoiding. She came home one afternoon with a school friend named Sora, the first friend she had voluntarily brought through the door in Yin's memory of her life. He pretended not to notice them unpacking snacks on the kitchen table, and quietly had their grandfather add another bowl to dinner. He was learning, in these ordinary hours, what he had come back for. The reality of it was smaller and more specific than the idea he had carried for years. Not a concept, a lamp on a bedside table, the sound of John's voice from the next room, his grandfather pressing an extra portion of something onto his plate with a firm, settled satisfaction. He should have had longer to settle into it. The message came on a Thursday evening, not to his phone, to a channel he had kept active from his camp years because discarding it entirely would have been its own signal. A short, codified string of text that meant, in the organizational language of the numbers, that a priority directive had been issued. He read it once, and put the phone face down on his desk. The camp had declared him a traitor. This was expected. He had known from the day he walked out that the label would follow him. What the message communicated beyond the label was more specific. Assets were already in motion. The directive was active. He sat for a long moment. His grandfather called from the kitchen that the rice was ready. He came to the table and ate, and answered the questions about his day, and helped clear the plates. He noticed John watching him across the table, not with alarm, just with the careful attention she had been applying to him since the first week. She had started to read the small register of differences that indicated when he was processing something he wouldn't volunteer. He did not sleep much that night, not from fear. He was mapping, the way the camp had taught him, understanding the terrain before moving through it, reducing the unknown surface area. The assets in motion would be former numbers, people he had trained beside, and, in several cases, pulled out of situations that would have killed them. They would be good. He knew how good specifically, because he knew each of them. Number 002 arrived 4 days later. Yin became aware of him first as a pattern of presences, someone accessing the same routes he used to school in the morning, at an interval that preserved plausible deniability, not quite overlapping but close enough. The timing had the quality of someone maintaining visual contact from 2 blocks back, which was camp standard surveillance discipline. He would have been invisible to someone who hadn't been trained in the same methodology. Yin gave him 2 more days, and then sat on a bench near the river on a Sunday morning, visible and stationary. 002 sat on the opposite end of the bench. 11 minutes later, he was older than Yin remembered, which was predictable, given that Yin had been gone for a year and a half, and had last seen 002 under circumstances that aged people. He had cut his hair differently. He held himself with the contained stillness of someone who has been living with a specific task for a while. They sat without speaking for a moment. Below the bench, the river moved through its stone banks. 002 said the directive was genuine and active. He said 3 other numbers were in the city, or incoming, with a specific mandate. He looked at the water. Yin asked which 3. 002 gave the numbers 004, 006, and one recently elevated number, whose current combat performance, 002, described in terms that communicated respect without pleasure. Yin said he understood. 002 said there was something else. During the period between Yin's departure and now, 4 numbers who had been dispatched on hunting assignments had died. Their deaths had been reported to the organization as Yin's kills. He said the official record attributed all 4 to Yin's account. Evidence gathered and submitted to camp leadership by number 003. The river moved below them. Yin said he had not killed any of them. 002 said he knew. He had been watching the pattern. The timing of 3 of the 4 deaths did not align with Yin's confirmed movement during those windows, and the method used on 2 of them was not in Yin's documented repertoire, but was consistent with 003's. He had been compiling this for months. He had said nothing inside the organization because the architecture of the directive left no channel for that kind of argument to survive. Yin looked at the water for a moment. He had known 003 since the early years in the camp. A quiet, technically exceptional operator who had always seemed more interested in the organization's internal structure than its external missions. The kind of person who would have understood immediately, on the day Yin left, what political value the Traitor 001 narrative carried for someone positioned correctly within leadership. The kind who would have moved to shape it. He asked 002 what he wanted from this conversation. 002 said he hadn't received orders to report the conversation. He said he would continue his assignment officially. He said that if situations arose where information would prevent unnecessary things from happening to people who weren't involved in the original dispute, he might find ways to ensure that information moved. It was not an offer of alliance. It was a narrower thing than that. A specific kind of professional courtesy from someone who had looked at the evidence and reached a conclusion they couldn't share publicly. Yin accepted it in the spirit it was offered. He went home and sat with his grandfather after dinner and watched the end of a television program about ocean fishing that Kong Shu had been following for 3 episodes. The boats were very small against the water they sat on. His grandfather fell asleep in his chair before the episode finished, and Yin quietly turned the volume down. He sat in the low television light and thought about 003. Not with anger. The camp had been thorough about teaching him what anger cost at the operational level, and he had internalized that lesson completely. With the same attention he gave problems that required solutions. 003 had framed him for 4 deaths, had deliberately strengthened the directive against him, and was still inside the organization where this made them useful to certain people. The problem would not resolve itself from a distance. The next week at school, he completed 2 assessments and received a returned essay with a comment from his literature teacher suggesting his writing had improved significantly. He did not tell her that his primary education, up until several months ago, had not involved literature essays. John passed him in the hallway between classes and looked approximately happy, which was a status she had not worn easily for the first weeks after his return. She was walking next to Sora, and they were discussing something with the focused momentum of students who have reached the interesting part of a disagreement about something that does not matter much. He watched her for a moment before turning back. He was going to protect all of this. He had made that decision when he walked through the arrivals hall. Nothing in the current situation changed it. He found the first of the incoming numbers on Wednesday, not 004 or 006, the other one, the elevated number 002 had described. She was waiting near the SW Group building entrance in the early evening, positioned with the particular patience of someone who has done surveillance in difficult conditions and regards this urban assignment as almost relaxed by comparison. She had not moved to approach. She was still in observation phase, building context before committing to action. Standard practice. He had used it himself. He walked past her and into the building and went about his afternoon assignment without changing his pattern, letting her observe. The value of the next phase would come from her believing she understood the rhythm of his routine. Jay called him into her office at the end of the afternoon to review the next week's assignment slate. She handed him the scheduling document, and he noted, without looking up from it, that someone would likely be approaching him within a few days from a specific direction, and that this might affect his availability for Thursday's session. Jay was quiet for a moment. She said she would need more than that if she was going to reallocate the session resources. He said the person was connected to his time abroad and that their intentions were complicated. He said he had it structured. He said if any of it reached a point where the group's interests were affected, he would notify her immediately. She looked at him with the expression she had deployed during their first meeting, assessing, precise, holding the discomfort of incomplete information in the way of someone who has learned that demanding complete information from certain kinds of people is a way of losing them. She said Thursday's session was moved to Friday. He thanked her. Outside the building, the evening was cooling toward autumn, and the woman from the numbers organization was still in her position, patient and unreadable, and completely unaware that the meeting she had just observed accomplished nothing, had in fact accomplished something she would not account for until later. Her name was Alice. She had been number 005 in the organization. She had been sent not only to find him, but to build leverage. Context that could be used to ensure the target had reasons beyond self-preservation to comply with directives. Family, employment, routine. She was looking at all three from a reasonable distance on a Wednesday evening in Seoul, and she believed she had time to build her picture carefully before the next phase. She did not know that she was the one being observed. Alice spent 3 days building her picture of his life. She was thorough, camp-trained thoroughness, the kind that operates through patience rather than speed. She mapped his morning schedule, his route to school, the timing of his SW group visits. She identified his grandfather's apartment building by following him home on the first evening. She noted Kongshu's habits through the ground floor windows, the old man's early rising, his trips to the market 2 blocks north, his particular bench in the small park adjacent to the building, where he sat on dry afternoons with a newspaper he appeared to read entirely. She noted his sister's schedule separately. She noted the school friend. She was assembling leverage. This was standard organizational methodology for a target who could not be reliably subdued through direct confrontation alone. Build the surrounding pressure until compliance became the rational option. She had done this work before and found it clean and efficient. On the 4th morning, she went to the market 2 blocks north, at the time Kongshu usually arrived. Yin was already there. He was standing near the vegetable stalls with a cloth shopping bag, examining a bundle of spring onions with the focused interest of someone who had been instructed by a grandparent about exactly what to look for. He did not turn when she entered the market. She stopped in the entrance. He said, without turning, that she was blocking the morning foot traffic coming in behind her. She moved to the side. Her hand went to the jacket's inner pocket out of training instinct. She checked the movement immediately. The market was full. Morning crowd, elderly shoppers and stall owners, who had been here since before dawn. Wrong context entirely. He placed the spring onions in the bag and turned. She had seen his file photograph, which had been assembled from surveillance footage, and was consequently flat and slightly out of focus in the way surveillance photography always is. The photograph had not prepared her for the quality of attention he directed at her, not threatening, not performed. The kind that sees the room through you as it sees you. He asked if she would like to talk somewhere that wasn't a vegetable market. She said she would. They sat in a tea house 1 street over, at a table in the back corner. Both of them, independently, sat with their backs to the wall and a clear line to the entrance. They noticed the coincidence simultaneously. Neither of them commented on it. She gave him the formal directive statement, the organizational language that constituted official notification. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he told her he had not killed the 4 numbers attributed to his record. She said that was not her assessment's focus. She said her task was leverage construction, not combat resolution. He said he understood. He asked her to tell him the specific evidence 003 had submitted to support the attributed kills. She was quiet. She had reviewed that file as part of her briefing package. She answered. He walked her through 3 of the 4 incidents: location, timing, method, and demonstrated, with specific reference to the organizational movement logs she would have access to, that 2 of the 3 were structurally impossible to attribute to him if the logs were accurate. He did not tell her 003 had done it. He simply placed the evidence in a sequence and let the sequence do its work. She sat with her tea cooling in front of her. She was not an operator who confused loyalty with irrationality. The numbers system demanded competence, and competence included the ability to revise a position when the evidence required it. She had been sent here with a specific picture of the situation. The picture was developing new details. She said she would need time to verify what he had described. He said that was reasonable. He said he had no interest in harming her, that his interest was in the problem created by 003's actions, and that if she found herself in a situation during her time in Seoul where the organization's instructions were creating a danger she hadn't signed up for, she could come back to this table. She looked at him for a long moment. She said she would be in touch. He finished his tea and went back to the market to get the spring onions his grandfather had sent him for. 004 arrived on a Saturday. He made no effort to conceal himself. This was, Yin recognized, a deliberate choice. 004 had always operated on the premise that visible confidence served its own deterrent function, and he had the physical architecture to support it. He was broader than Yin remembered, the kind of broad that comes from years of sustained physical conditioning rather than youth. He had a small horizontal scar below his left cheekbone that was new. He found Yin in the SW Group's ground floor lobby after a training session and sat in one of the chairs nobody used and crossed his arms. Yin sat across from him. 004 said he had reviewed the same material Alice had described. He said he had also spoken to 002. He said his situation was that he had received a legitimate organizational directive and had personal doubts about the case that supported it, and he was not yet certain which side of that tension he was going to resolve on. Yin said that sounded like an honest position. 004 said that in the meantime, two things were true. He would not be moving against Yin's family, and he would not be reporting this conversation. He said these were personal choices he was making, and not offers of assistance. Yin said he respected the distinction. 004 looked around the lobby, the real stone floors, the quiet staff, the elevator bank, with the expression of someone computing an unfamiliar context. He said Yin looked like he was doing something like living a normal life. Yin said he was trying. 004 looked at him for a moment, with something that was not quite approval, and not quite its absence. He stood, uncrossed his arms, and left through the main entrance without further comment. 006 never sat down. She made contact in a park near the school on a Tuesday afternoon, fell into step beside him for half a block, passed him a folded piece of paper in the manner of a handoff, and was gone around a corner before the exchange would have been visible to anyone watching from a standard surveillance position. The paper contained a grid reference and a time. It was 003's operational notation style, slightly modified. She had intercepted a communication. He went to the location at the indicated time. 006 was already there, standing near a chain-link fence with her hands in her jacket pockets. She told him that 003 had been in contact with an outside organization, not the camp, a separate entity that operated in similar spaces, sometimes competitively. She said 003 had been positioning for some time to move assets toward this other organization, and the Traitor 001 narrative was not purely personal or loyalty-driven. It served 003's negotiating posture with the outside party, a delivered solution to a standing problem being worth considerably more than an ongoing one. Yin absorbed this. 006 said she did not have hard documentation. She said she had heard enough and was not willing to participate in something that had this architecture. She left before he answered, which told him she was not looking for reciprocity. She had given him what she had because the situation required it, and the transaction was closed. He walked home through the early dark, thinking about 003, the specific operational intelligence of building a narrative that served three purposes simultaneously: eliminating a potential rival from within the organization, generating leverage with an outside party, and doing so in a way that used the camp's own loyalty structure as the enforcement mechanism. It was elegant. It was also the kind of move that left the person who made it overextended in ways they might not have fully mapped. He was going to take that apart. Not yet. But the shape of the approach was becoming clearer. The school trip to Jeju Island was announced on a Wednesday. 2 nights, the full second-year cohort, a standard educational itinerary with a domestic flight each way. John came home with the permission form already filled out by herself. She had signed it in Kong Shu's looping characters with an accuracy that made Yin look at her briefly before deciding not to address it directly. His grandfather, when shown the form, said he thought the trip sounded wonderful and immediately began asking which jacket John would bring for the cooler evenings. The flight departed at 8 in the morning on a Thursday. Yin's bodyguard assignment that week was a light load, and Jay had approved his accompanying the school trip in the loose, informal capacity of an older sibling on the same flight, which was a cover that satisfied the school administration's requirement for additional adult-to-student ratios without requiring paperwork that would invite questions about exactly who he was. He sat 3 rows behind John on the plane. He read a chapter of the history text he had fallen behind on. He ate the small triangle of bread the cabin crew passed out and looked out the window at the coast below. 20 minutes into the flight, 4 men stood up simultaneously. They came from different sections of the cabin: coordinated timing, pre-assigned positions, the practiced quality of people who have rehearsed the spacing. 2 moved to block the front galley. 1 moved to the rear. The 4th stood in the aisle near the middle of the cabin and produced a weapon and addressed the cabin at a volume designed to immediately establish the terms. Students in Yin's field of view went through the rapid sequence of disbelief, resolving into terror. A teacher in the row ahead tried to stand and was told, sharply, to sit. The 4th man repeated his terms. The plane would redirect, passengers would remain seated and quiet, and outcomes would be determined by compliance. Yin was looking at the positioning. 4 men, 4 points, organized to prevent a single response from multiple angles simultaneously. Professional configuration for a civilian cabin. The weapon he could see from his seat was real. He did not need to see the other 3 weapons to know they were there. The crew in the front galley had both hands visible and flat on the counter, which meant they had been shown something that produced that specific response. John was 4 rows forward. She had gone very still. Not the trembling stillness of shock, but the learned stillness of someone who had spent months being invisible in a hallway, applied now at altitude. Her hands were in her lap. She was looking at the seat back in front of her. He stayed seated. He ran the geometry. The man in the aisle was the coordination point. If he went down first, the other 3 would lose their timing, and any unified response would fall apart before it could be synchronized. The rear man was secondary. Front 2 were working the crew, which was their functional leverage, but the crew as leverage was only worth something if the cabin wasn't already destabilized. He needed to move before the organization settled fully into place. The first minutes were always the window. He had approximately 40 seconds before the configuration solidified. He stood up. The man in the aisle turned and told him to sit down. He was already moving toward him. What happened in the next 2 minutes was understood differently by different people in the cabin, depending on their sightline and their capacity to process rapid movement under acute stress. The cabin crew member nearest the rear later described it in terms that suggested she had stopped being certain of the sequence of events approximately 4 seconds into it. Several students in the middle section were looking at their laps and felt the plane shift slightly, a micro-event in the aircraft's balance that lasted less than a second, and then there was a loud sound from the front galley, and then it was quiet again. The man in the aisle was down. The rear man had moved forward to assist and encountered a problem that resulted in him occupying the floor of the aisle with his hands pressed behind his back and 1 knee on his neck. The 2 front men had been addressed in the galley, while Yin had the cabin's sightline blocked, faster than they had oriented to the commotion in the main cabin. 43 seconds from the moment he stood, he secured the weapons, all 4, collected methodically while the men on the floor were still processing the transition from operational to incapacitated. He passed them to the nearest crew member with the request that she put them in the flight deck for the duration of the flight and lock the door after the captain was briefed. He said the men were secured and the flight could continue on its original routing. She looked at him. He was 17 years old and wearing the plain jacket he had brought for the Jeju evenings and holding 4 secured weapons with the practiced care of someone who had done this the way other people handle familiar kitchen tools. She took the weapons and went to the flight deck. The cabin was very quiet. John turned in her seat and looked at him. Her face was doing something complicated that he did not have a good taxonomy for. Shock and recognition, and something else underneath both. The expression of someone watching a category they had placed something in dissolve and not yet having a new one ready. He sat back down. He reopened his history text to the page he had marked. The plane continued south, the coast appearing again below the cloud break, morning light spreading across the water. Nobody spoke to him for the rest of the flight. On the island, during the first afternoon's scheduled site visit, John appeared at his side while a teacher was organizing the group near the entrance of a historical site. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said his name, not as a question, not with accusation, just his name, as though she was confirming something. He looked at her. She said she had not told Kong Shu about the things she had been working out in her head. She said she thought, when he was ready, it would be better coming from him. He said that was thoughtful of her. She said she was going to go look at the site now. She went. He stood outside the entrance and looked at the coast visible past the stone walls, the water flat and blue in the afternoon, and felt something he did not have a clean name for, the weight of being known more than he had planned to be, and the particular relief that comes when that is not a disaster. They flew back on Saturday morning without incident. He sat in the same row and read the remaining 2 chapters. The message from 002 came on Sunday. It was brief. It said that a coordinated operation had been organized at an organizational level above the hunt directives, not a single asset deployment, but a group action, multiple numbers and external hired contractors, targeting the surrounding structure. It gave a time window. It ended with a grid reference. The grid reference was a warehouse district near the port. Yin went through the information methodically. The action was designed not to engage him directly. That approach had been tried, and had apparently generated reports that made direct engagement look uneconomical. This was broader. Take away the surrounding structure, the people, the positions, and the target becomes simpler. He could not prevent all of it. He could reduce the cost. He contacted Park from the SW Group security team. He said there was a situation developing that was specific to him and not connected to any group client, that it involved his past, and that he understood if the team's involvement was outside the group's mandate. Park was quiet for several seconds. Then he said he would make some calls. The warehouse district was a grid of narrow access roads and loading bays, most of them quiet on Sunday nights, the industrial rhythm of the port running on its own track at a distance. Yin arrived 40 minutes before the window 002 had indicated, and spent those 40 minutes understanding the space. Rooflines, approaches, which structures had connecting access routes, and which were genuinely isolated. He found 008 already in position near the east access point. 008 was 6 years younger than Yin in the numbers sequence, but had been in the camp nearly as long. He was compact and quiet, and had always operated with a slight suppressed energy, the kind that comes from someone who is built for close-range confrontation, but runs on patience. He acknowledged Yin with a look and continued monitoring the approach road. They took positions in silence, not the silence of strangers, the silence of 2 people who have worked in enough tight situations together to have developed a non-verbal operational shorthand. Yin noted which approach 008 was covering and adjusted his own field accordingly. 004 appeared 8 minutes later from the western access point, which told Yin that 002 had moved more broadly than a single message. He did not ask about the chain. There was no time for it, and it didn't change the geometry. The contractors came in at 37 minutes past his arrival. There were more of them than the message had suggested, not dramatically, but enough to mean the division of coverage was immediately stressed. They were competent in the way of people who have been paid for serious work before, but have been briefed on a single teenager, which meant the opening of their deployment was misconfigured for the actual problem they were walking into. The first 6 minutes were manageable. Yin moved through the eastern section with the efficiency of someone operating in his deepest competence, controlled, deliberate, precise, about which incapacitations needed to be permanent resolutions to the immediate problem and which ones simply needed to remove a variable from the active board. He stayed aware of 008 and 004's positions through sound and movement, the way you track allies in a confined space. At 7 minutes, the sound profile changed. He was near the central loading bay when he heard it. A different quality of fall, something wrong in the weight of it. Not someone going down in a controlled descent, something involuntary. He moved to 008's last known position. 008 was on the ground against the warehouse wall, one hand pressed to his left side, the other keeping weight off his elbow. He had been hit by a round from behind. The trajectory was clear from the angle he had fallen. The shot had come from the second tier of the access structure above the eastern gate, a position that hadn't been covered in the initial sweep, because nobody had expected the deployment to include an elevated element. His hand was very dark against his jacket. Yin was beside him in the time it takes to cross a narrow bay. He assessed the wound quickly, the hand placement, 008's breathing, the color of his face in the bad lighting. The round had not gone clean through. It was deep, and the rate of loss visible on his jacket told him the margin was shorter than he wanted to think about. 008 looked up at him. His expression was collected. Not brave performance, just the habitual compression of someone trained to limit the information their face gives away in operational conditions. He said he had it covered. Yin said he knew he did, and put his hand over 008's and applied more pressure, more than 008 would have applied to himself, out of the instinct to minimize acknowledgement of the situation. 004 had cleared the elevated position by the time the contractors attempted to consolidate. They found a problem they hadn't accounted for, and most of them withdrew to outside the district in stages that suggested organized retreat rather than rout. Someone sensible had called it. The remainder were in positions they would not be getting up from for several hours. Yin already had his phone out. The contact he needed was not in his standard directory. It was a number he had kept from the camp years, a physician named Gagner who had operated in conflict zones on the moral principle that excellent medical attention should not be contingent on which side of a particular line you stood on. Gagner had treated numbers operatives, opposition casualties, and civilians with the same technical attention. He was one of the few people from those years who had remained in Yin's memory with no ambivalence attached. He called. Gagner answered on the third ring. Yin described the wound in the specific clinical terms the camp had taught for medical communication in the field. He gave the district location. He said he needed discreet transport and immediate surgical capability, and that he would arrange compensation. Gagner said he was calling a colleague and asked for the exact coordinates. 004 was already lifting 008 into a position that would allow movement. 008 was conscious and complaining, at reduced volume, about the specific inconvenience of the situation. His grip on his own jacket was tight. They moved him to the street level, while Yin stayed on the phone with Gagner's colleague, a woman named Dr. Park, who was directing them to a specific address while simultaneously, apparently, assembling the resources the situation required. Her voice carried the particular focused calm of someone for whom this was not the first time she had been called at 11 on a Sunday. The vehicle came. 008 went in it. Yin stayed outside the vehicle with his hand on the doorframe until it pulled away and the taillights were into the street. He stood in the warehouse district with the industrial sound of the port at a distance and the quiet of an aftermath settling around him. 004 was beside him. After a moment, 004 said that had been a significant miscalculation on the organization's part regarding the scale of the response they were going to meet. Yin said it was. 004 looked at the access road where the vehicle had turned. He said, without further preamble, that his personal doubts had resolved themselves. Yin looked at him. 004 said he would be needing somewhere to stay. That was not the address the organization had him on record for, and that if Yin happened to know of a location that was sufficiently off-record, he would appreciate the detail at his earliest convenience. Yin gave him an address, a second apartment in Kong Shu's building that a neighbor had mentioned was empty and between tenants. He said he would arrange the access. 004 memorized it and left without ceremony. Yin stood alone for another minute. The port sounds continued at their own rhythm, indifferent and steady. He was thinking about 008 on the floor of that loading bay, the controlled face, the hand pressed hard against the wound, the degree of quiet that a person achieves when they're working hard to keep their situation from becoming other people's problem. He had known 008 for years. He had trained beside him in conditions that made tonight look managed and almost moderate. He did not want 008 to die in a city where he had come to recover a normal life. He called Gagner again. Gagner said the surgery was already in preparation and that 008 was stable in transit. He said he would call Yin directly as soon as there was a post-operative assessment. Yin thanked him. He walked home through the city at midnight, past the bright shop fronts closed for the night, and the occasional person still out, carrying the cloth shopping bag he had brought from that morning, without having had a reason to use it. The streets were quiet. The apartment building was dark, except for the light his grandfather always left on in the entryway for him. He came inside. He hung up his jacket and washed his hands for a long time at the kitchen sink. Kong Shu appeared in the doorway in his house slippers. He looked at Yin with the unhurried attention of someone who has been awake since late evening and has spent that time deciding which questions to ask. He asked if Yin had eaten. Yin said not recently. Kong Shu went to the refrigerator. He moved with the deliberate efficiency of someone who is channeling a complicated feeling into a practical one, opening containers, finding things, setting the pot on the low burner. He talked while he did it, small talk, the neighborhood, a conversation he had had with a fruit vendor that afternoon about the season's persimmons. His hands were steady. He set a bowl in front of Yin and sat across from him with a glass of water he didn't drink. He said, in the middle of nothing in particular, that he knew Yin's life had complicated parts he had not told him about. He said he had known this since the first week. He said he was not going to push on it, because Yin had come back and he was here, and that was the thing that mattered. He said he just needed to know that Yin was going to keep coming back. Yin looked at his grandfather across the kitchen table. The pressed jacket from the airport worn to softness now. The careful eyes. The hands that had written his name on a sign in large, practiced characters, because the handwriting needed to be readable from a crowd. He said yes. Kongshu nodded. He refilled Yin's glass and went to bed. Gangyer called at 6 in the morning. Yin was already awake, sitting at the desk in his room with the history text open to a page he had not been reading. The lamp was on. The glass of water his grandfather had set out the night before was empty. He picked up on the first ring. Gangyer said the surgery had gone for 3 hours and 20 minutes. He said the round had caused significant internal damage that Dr. Park had addressed with a precision Gangyer described, in the specific language of someone who rarely gave compliments, as exceptional. He said 008 had lost a serious quantity of blood and that the next 48 hours would indicate the recovery trajectory, but that the initial post-operative indicators were better than the entry wound had suggested they would be. He said 008 had been conscious for approximately 4 minutes before the anesthetic's tail end brought him back down, and that during those 4 minutes he had asked, in order, the time, whether anyone else had been hit, and whether someone had called Yin. Yin stayed on the line without speaking for a moment. Gangyer said he would call again at noon with a further update, and that the location was secure and off any record that could be traced through normal channels. Yin thanked him, and meant it specifically, which was different from the general expression. He sat with the phone in his hand after the call ended, and let the information settle. 8 would live. The night had cost something. The wound, the blood, the 48 hours still to come. But it had not cost that. He set the phone down and closed the history text, and looked at the window, where the city was beginning to move through its early color, the particular gray-pink of dawn over dense rooftops. He was at the SW Group offices by 8 with nothing in his expression that communicated the previous night's events. Jay looked at him when he came in, and then looked at the scheduling document she was holding, and then back at him, with the practiced restraint of someone who has decided not to ask a question they already partly know the answer to. He gave her a brief summary. Not all of it. The organizational structure behind it, the numbers, the directive, enough that she understood the scale of what had happened, and what resources might have been compromised. He said the immediate threat had been reduced significantly, and that the situation with 008 was managed. She was quiet for several seconds. Outside the glass wall of her office, the security team's morning briefing was audible, Jinsu's voice running through the day's assignments in his steady, slightly flat delivery. Jay said she was going to make a call to Chairman Guang's office. She said the chairman had resources that existed outside the company's standard operational channels, and that if a medical situation required sustained discretion, that network was more reliable than what Yin had arranged independently. Yin said he had already arranged the medical situation adequately. She said she knew. She was talking about the next several weeks. He looked at her. She had already opened the line on her desk phone. She spoke briefly, the name of a contact at Guang's office, a reference number, a short clinical description of what was needed. She held the call for less than 4 minutes and ended it with a confirmation. She set the phone down and told him the arrangement was made. Then she opened the scheduling document and continued the morning briefing as though she had simply answered a logistical detail rather than quietly extended the group's private infrastructure to keep a wounded mercenary alive and untraceable. He filed this. Jay was a person who did large things in small gestures, and this was the largest he had seen from her yet. 008 was moved to the new location 2 days later, once Dr. Park confirmed the transfer was safe. The address was a private medical facility connected to a conglomerate subsidiary, one of those places that had the external appearance of a corporate health clinic and the actual capability of a small surgical hospital. The staff moved with the confident economy of people who understood they were serving a context that didn't ask for explanations. 004 visited on the 3rd day and sat in the corridor for 2 hours without being admitted, because 008's recovery protocol limited visitors, and then left without complaint. He came back the following morning at the same time. 006 sent a package with no sender information. A specific soup, still warm, packed in insulated containers, with a note that said only the temperature window for maximum benefit, and a time for reheating. The handwriting was precise. 002 arranged the visit for a Thursday afternoon and sat beside 008's bed and had a conversation that Yin was not present for, but whose outcome was visible in 002's posture afterward. A kind of resolution that had been pending for a long time and had finally found its moment. 008 himself, by the end of the first week, had started complaining. This was, Dr. Park explained to Yin with the mild expression of a professional who has seen this pattern before, the most reliable indicator of genuine recovery, the return of a patient's capacity to have opinions about their circumstances. 008's opinions were specific. The pillow was too flat. The light came from the wrong angle. Someone had apparently chosen the room's wall color without adequate consultation. Yin brought him a different pillow and said nothing about the wall. The birthday dinner was Kong Shu's idea, though he framed it as simply a meal, because his grandfather had a deep suspicion of occasions that announced themselves too loudly. Yin had not told him the specific date. He himself had been uncertain, in the early years back, whether the date on the camp's records for him was accurate or assigned. But Kong Shu had found the original family register in a box of documents he had kept for 10 years, with the specific patience of someone who had never fully accepted that keeping them was irrational. He had cross-referenced it carefully, and the date was right, and he had said nothing to Yin about any of this. He simply said one evening that he thought they should have the big table this weekend. He said he had made some phone calls. The big table was a leaf that pulled out from the kitchen table's underside and nearly doubled its surface, a mechanism Yin had not known existed until his grandfather deployed it with the practiced ease of a man who had used it at important occasions for decades. 002 arrived first because he always oriented to the earliest end of a time window. He brought a bottle of something that Kong Shu accepted with a pleased, slightly formal thank you and immediately opened. 004 came next with his hands in his pockets, looked around the small apartment with the expression of someone from a specific background adjusting to an unfamiliar environment, and then sat where Kong Shu directed him and talked to John about the neighborhood for 20 minutes, with the complete focus of someone who had decided to try the social interaction seriously. 006 had made something, a specific dish she set on the counter without announcement, in the container she had brought it in, and then stood to the side until Kong Shu discovered it and made the expression of someone who has been given exactly what they would have asked for if they had thought to ask. Alice came. She stood in the doorway for a moment before coming in, because the scene on the other side of the threshold was not what the briefing had prepared her for, and recalibrating took a second. She had brought nothing and apologized for it. Kong Shu told her to sit down immediately and that she was not to apologize again. 008 was not there. He was still 2 weeks from clearance for anything involving extended sitting. John had made a separate container of food that she was taking to him the following afternoon, a plan she described to the room with the practical efficiency of someone who has already organized the logistics and is simply communicating the schedule. Yin sat at the table between his grandfather and his sister and looked at the full room, the mismatched chairs pulled from 3 different corners of the apartment, the overlapping conversations, the food Kong Shu was still producing in quantities that assumed everyone would eat twice, and felt the strange, specific fullness of a moment that is exactly what it appears to be. His grandfather caught his eye from the other end of the table and raised his glass without ceremony. Just that. Yin raised his in return. The question of 003 had not disappeared during any of this. It had run underneath the weeks like a current below the surface of a river, present, directional, not requiring the surface to know it was there. Yin had been accumulating. The specific documentation 006 had intercepted, the movement logs he had walked Alice through, the pattern of deaths that 002 had been quietly building a record of for months. He had organized all of it into a sequence that required no argument, only reading. He sent it to the camp's senior leadership through a channel that 003 would have no visibility on. Not a demand, not an accusation, in the operational sense. Simply the information, structured, so that the sequence of events was the argument. He had learned a long time ago that the most durable kind of exposure is the kind that doesn't require the exposer's voice. The evidence speaks, and the source becomes secondary, a detail, almost irrelevant. The response came 8 days later. The hunt directive against him was suspended pending organizational review. The language was institutional and careful, the kind that covers itself in multiple directions simultaneously, but the operative word was suspended, and the timeline was indefinite. 003 would know. The specific information filed, the channel used, the timing, any competent operator would reconstruct the source in under an hour. This would make 003 dangerous in a new way. Cornered operatives with 003's capabilities were not safer than directed ones. The opposite. But the narrative that had been running against Yin inside the organization was now structurally compromised, and every number who had been operating on that narrative as a given had to revise their position. 004, when told, said simply, good. 002 said he would watch 003's position and report any movement. Alice said she was staying in Seoul for now. She said this with the brevity of someone stating a logistical fact rather than announcing a decision, but there was something underneath it that was the weight of a person who has recently found the surrounding situation more interesting than the assignment she had arrived to complete. The drug operation surfaced from an unexpected direction. A police officer named Go had been working a case involving a foreign crime syndicate moving a specific synthetic compound through the port district. His case was not the most resourced one in his division. It had been deprioritized twice by supervisors whose interest in the port district's activity stopped at certain specific thresholds. But Go had the quality of someone who had decided a long time ago that their work was the work, regardless of what the institutional environment thought about it. He had gotten close enough to the operation that the syndicate noticed him. On a Wednesday evening, he was hospitalized with injuries consistent with a targeted assault, multiple fractures, concussive trauma, the kind that communicates a specific message about the cost of continued proximity. His subordinate, a young officer named Hee Young-suk, had been with him. She had stepped in front of a second hit that had not been telegraphed, taking the impact on her side and back rather than letting it reach Go's unconscious form on the ground. She was hospitalized alongside him with significant injuries. The message of the assault was clear to anyone paying attention. The problem was that the people it was intended to silence were not the only ones paying attention. Duchik heard first. He arrived at the hospital in a state that the nursing staff later described, diplomatically, as highly focused. He was known in certain parts of the city as a man who had moved away from his earlier associations in a direction nobody had predicted, towards something that looked, if you squinted at it from the right angle, like a kind of neighborhood stewardship. He called Go his brother, which was not a biological description, but a precise one in every other sense. He sat outside Go's room for 6 hours without being granted entry, because visiting hours were visiting hours, and the ward nurse held the position on this with the undefeated firmness of someone who has been holding it since before the concept of exceptions was invented. He called Yin from the corridor at the end of those 6 hours. The call was short. Duchik described the situation and the syndicate's port operation and the specific people he believed were responsible, and then said he was going to handle it and would Yin like to be present. Yin said yes. They met in the port district the following evening. Dushik had done his own intelligence gathering in the 48 hours since the hospital, through channels the police case had not accessed because they operated in spaces that police intelligence didn't reach. He knew the warehouse the syndicate used for distribution coordination. He knew the arrival schedule. He knew the specific individuals present on a Thursday evening when the compound came in from the loading dock. He had an iron pipe. He was carrying it without concealing it, the way a person carries a tool they have decided they will need. Yin looked at this for a moment without comment. The warehouse had 8 people in it. 4 were logistics workers, with an indeterminate level of awareness about what they were moving. Yin identified them quickly by their positioning and posture. People doing a job, not guarding one. The other 4 were different. They had the particular alert quality of people who were present specifically because things could go wrong, and their function was to manage it. Yin removed the 4 from the equation before Duchik reached the interior. This was not discussed in advance. Duchik walked through the open space with the settled momentum of someone who has been waiting a significant number of hours to be in exactly this situation. The man responsible for coordinating the assault on Go was in the back office. Duchik found him behind his desk and was briefly blocked by a 5th man Yin had not identified from outside, a guard position inside the office, rather than the floor, which was a sensible layering of the defensive arrangement that Yin filed away as an oversight in his initial sweep. He resolved it quickly. Duchik stepped past the man on the floor and stopped in front of the desk. The coordinator was not a physical person. He had the build of someone who had always arranged for the physical work to be done by others, which was a reasonable professional choice, but left him without resources appropriate to the present moment. Duchik placed the iron pipe on the desk. He said Go was his brother. He said, Hai Yong-suk had a mother who called every day, and a dog she was worried about from the hospital bed, because nobody had fed him. Then, he picked the pipe back up, stood in the doorway of the office, and watched the wall behind the coordinator's head, and listened to the sounds of what was happening with the flat, professional attention of someone performing an assessment. He noted that it was thorough. He noted that it communicated its message with considerable clarity. When Duchik finished, he set the pipe down on the desk again, carefully, with a precision that was itself expressive, and turned. His breathing was controlled. His jacket had a small dark patch on the left sleeve. He looked at Yin and said they should go. They left through the loading bay. The evening was clear and cold, the port sounds running at their usual distance. Duchik walked with the deliberate pace of someone who is moving through the aftermath of a decision they made completely and have no interest in revising. 3 blocks from the warehouse, a vehicle pulled up alongside them. It stopped ahead of them at an angle that was not a parking angle. 2 men got out. One stayed near the vehicle's hood. The other came around the front with a directness of movement that indicated the conversation was not going to begin with pleasantries. He said something brief and specific about the warehouse. He said there were people who had interests in that warehouse's continued operation, and that those interests extended to the people currently being inconvenienced inside it. He reached inside his jacket. The other man by the hood produced a weapon and leveled it at the 2 of them. Duchik stood beside Yin in the cold night air of the port district. His iron pipe was still in his hand. He looked at the weapon, and then at Yin, with an expression that mixed alarm with a question, how this was going to go. Yin stood there speechless, not from fear, not from uncertainty about the physics of the next several seconds. He had computed those the moment the vehicle pulled up. The thing holding him still was simpler and more specific. The men in front of them were not the organization. They were not numbers, not camp-connected, not part of the architecture he had been navigating for months. They were local representatives of a foreign syndicate whose scale he had not yet fully mapped, and behind them was a structure he had not yet traced to its ceiling. The weapon was pointed at him and at Duchik, and the night was quiet around them, and the port moved at its own indifferent distance, and somewhere across the city, his grandfather had probably left the entryway light on. He had come back to reclaim a life that included being home before the light needed turning off. His hands were still, his breathing was even. The man with the weapon was watching him for the movement that would tell him what Yin intended. He had not moved yet,